She sat alone at a wedding she was never supposed to attend by herself. Everyone else had someone, a smile, a hand to hold, a reason to belong. But her seat at table 7 was empty, until a stranger in a suit whispered, "Pretend you came with me." Who was he? Why did he choose her of all people to save from her quiet humiliation? And what happens when a lie so small begins to uncover truths too big to ignore? Natalie thought it was just a moment of kindness. But what began as pretend soon became something deeper. Letters written, secrets kept, and a past neither of them could outrun. Was he hiding something about her mother's tragedy, or was he the only one who truly cared enough to tell her the truth? This isn't just a love story. It's a story about trust, betrayal, healing, and the courage to believe again. Because sometimes, all it takes to rewrite your life is one seat at the right table. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Let's begin. The scent of lavender and aged wood lingered faintly in the autumn breeze, weaving through rows of white chairs arranged neatly beneath golden maple trees. From where Natalie Bennett sat quietly, at table 7, every breeze felt like a whisper that didn't quite reach her. She watched a young couple nearby lean into each other's laughter, their champagne glasses catching the light like little suns. She wasn't supposed to be here alone, but she was, and every empty glance across the wedding lawn reminded her of it. It was her cousin Lila's wedding, the last of her family still in touch with her. Lila had insisted Natalie come, promising it would be relaxed, intimate, and full of love. The kind of thing people said when they didn't realize love. Sometimes could feel like a mirror turned the wrong way. Natalie had RSVP'd yes out of politeness. Then she had stayed out of obligation, but nothing in her wanted to be here now. The outdoor venue was stunning, rows of white chairs under a canopy of trees, delicate floral arrangements tied to every post, and warm fairy lights ready to flicker alive once dusk arrived. The lawn, once farmland, sloped gently toward a small pond where swans glided like they had nowhere to be. Everything was gentle, everything was lovely, and everything made her feel alone in the most precise way. She ran her hand along the side of her chair, the lace of her navy blue dress catching slightly on a splinter. She tugged it free and let her eyes wander again to the name cards placed at each seat. Her name stood politely beside an untouched glass of champagne. The seat to her right remained empty. A full hour into the reception, and no one had claimed it. A woman at the next table, draped in sequins and perfume, leaned toward her partner. Her whisper wasn't loud, but it wasn't private either. "She came alone," the woman said, barely glancing Natalie's way. "Isn't that sad?" The man gave a quiet laugh, not unkind, but indifferent, like she was a character in the background, not someone sitting 10 feet away. Natalie lowered her gaze and reached for her drink. Her fingers curled around the stem of the champagne flute. The glass felt too smooth, too cold, too clean. She didn't drink, not anymore, but lifting the glass gave her hands something to do, a kind of gentle armor. The music shifted to a softer melody, the kind that invited slow dances and soft smiles. She glanced around and saw nothing but pairs newlyweds, old lovers, friends wrapped in familiar arms. She had made it through the ceremony, through the clinking of glasses and the beginning of toasts. But now, it was growing harder to breathe. Maybe she could slip out, just quietly stand, walk to her car, and leave. No one would blame her. Lila was busy being blissfully in love. The bride shouldn't have to notice the woman in the corner who hadn't danced, hadn't laughed, hadn't truly arrived. She reached down for her purse, heart thudding softly with relief at the idea of escape. And then, before she could rise, there was a presence beside her. She hadn't noticed him walking up. There were no loud footsteps, no sudden introduction, just the quiet sense that someone had filled the air beside her, and the scent of cedar and something warmer, a note of amber, maybe brushed her shoulder. A hand touched the back of the empty chair next to her, fingers resting lightly, respectfully. A voice, deep but unforced. leaned in just enough to be heard above the soft music. "Pretend you came with me." Natalie turned. The man standing there wore a charcoal gray suit, the kind that didn't beg for attention but held it nonetheless. His hair was dark with touches of silver at the temples, not from age, but from life. His eyes soft gray. Steady met hers, not with charm, but with clarity. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't playing a game. And she didn't speak. She couldn't. Not right away. The man pulled the chair back and sat down with ease, as though they were picking up a conversation they'd been having for years. He set down his drink whiskey, neat, then glanced around, as if assessing the room not for danger, but for discomfort. Then, once more. His eyes met hers, still no smile, but something like reassurance. Natalie blinked. She'd forgotten how to hold her posture. Her hands had stilled in her lap, and she could feel her breathing shift slower, steadier. His presence was quiet, but grounding. And suddenly, the looks from the woman in sequins stopped mattering. The chair beside her wasn't empty anymore. Her seat didn't feel so exposed. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know what had prompted him to sit beside her. But as the breeze stirred the wildflowers on their table, and the lights above began to flicker on like tiny stars, she found herself still, present, and oddly comforted. She looked at him. He looked at her. The glass of champagne still sat untouched, and something in her chest, long dormant, stirred. Natalie hadn't planned to stay, even after the stranger sat beside her, even after his quiet voice and steady presence calmed something raw inside her. She still thought she'd leave after the next toast, but she didn't. She stayed, and somehow, the rest of the table changed because of it. The woman in sequins, who earlier whispered sideways glances, now kept her eyes on her plate. The man beside her adjusted his tie, then offered a polite smile toward Graham, as if trying to determine whether this was someone important. Natalie didn't mind. For the first time all evening, she didn't feel like someone to be explained. The man finally spoke again, his voice low and clear, with the slightest smile at the edge of it. "Graham Whitmore," he said simply, offering no business card, no title, just the name. Natalie gave hers in return, and he nodded once as if he already knew. And then, slowly, he began to ease into conversation, not with her alone, but with the whole table. He asked the couple across from them how they knew the groom. He complimented the flowers, asked about the local food, made a joke about the playlist being stuck in 2003. Everything about him was composed, but not distant, light-hearted, but not shallow. There was nothing performative in his presence, only intention and kindness. Natalie found herself laughing once. Then again, the kind of small, surprised laugh that escaped before she could stop it. She didn't say much, but Graham made space for her anyway, subtle pauses in conversation where her thoughts might fit, gentle glances that reminded her she was part of this moment. Not a tag-along, not a mistake, someone worth talking to. The late afternoon sun began its slow descent, casting a golden hue across the wedding lawn. The soft glow made Graham's features look almost younger, less polished, more open. And for just a moment, Natalie wondered what his story was, why he'd sat beside her, why someone like him, with such quiet confidence, would choose to blend into a wedding alone. She didn't ask, but part of her wanted to. When the music picked up again, and a voice called for the next dance set, couples rose from their tables and made their way to the open wooden floor under the trees. Graham didn't move, neither did she. They remained seated, two strangers sharing a moment stitched together by circumstance and curiosity. As the dancing began, Natalie found herself leaning slightly toward him, not for any reason she could explain, just drawn in by the stillness he carried with him. She noticed the way he watched the dancers, his eyes soft, not envious, but almost remembering something. Then he turned to her, his gaze holding just enough weight to pause her breath. "Thank you," he said gently. She tilted her head, unsure what he meant, for not asking questions. He added after a moment, "Some days, That's the kindest thing someone can do. Natalie didn't reply, but in her silence, there was understanding. The evening waned, the sky shifted from pale peach to lavender, then deeper into indigo. Stars began to peek through like shy witnesses. The lights above their heads brightened, flickering once before settling into a soft, golden hum. People began saying goodbyes. Laughter turned into yawns. Shoes came off, and chairs emptied one by one. But Natalie and Graham lingered, not talking, just watching, breathing in the end of something. Eventually, he rose. "I should head out," he said. She followed his lead, rising too, brushing invisible creases from her skirt. They stepped outside the tent into the open air. The chill of evening had crept in, just enough to make her wrap her arms around herself. Graham didn't offer a coat, and oddly, she appreciated that. She wasn't cold, just aware. They stopped near the white fence that lined the edge of the property, looking out toward the dark stretch of trees beyond. He didn't make small talk, didn't ask for her number, didn't hint at next time. Instead, he offered her one last look, steady, kind, and said, simply, "Thanks for the company." Then he turned, walked toward the gravel path that led to the parking lot, and disappeared into the night. Natalie stayed there a moment longer, her hand resting gently on the top rail of the fence. The wood was rough under her fingers. A dry leaf blew past her shoe. The music inside the tent faded into something soft and slow. She hadn't danced. She hadn't cried. But something had shifted. A stranger had stepped into her evening and sat beside her, not because he had to, but because he chose to. And he didn't take anything with him when he left, except, perhaps, the sharpest edges of her loneliness. She watched the path where he'd gone until the darkness swallowed it whole. Then she breathed in deeply, as if to hold on to whatever warmth still lingered in the air. It didn't make sense, not yet, but somehow, it felt real. 3 days after the wedding, Natalie found a pale blue envelope nestled among the bills and flyers in her mailbox. It stood out instantly, not because it was large or ornate, but because it looked personal. The kind of envelope someone chooses on purpose, not the kind sent by algorithms or companies with coupons inside. Her name was written in cursive, with care, the kind of handwriting no one rushed. She carried it inside as if it were fragile, setting it on her kitchen counter like a small secret. She made tea, watched the kettle until it sang, then sat down with the envelope between her hands, unsure why she felt nervous. When she opened it, the scent of paper and ink faintly sweet, like cedar and dust, rose gently. The letter itself was just one page, no extravagance, no signature in gold, just Graham's voice on paper, steady and sincere. He thanked her for letting him sit beside her, for playing along when he hadn't offered much context. He said he didn't always do well in crowds anymore, that weddings were harder than people thought, and that her company, quiet as it was, had made the evening easier. Natalie read it twice, then 3 times. She folded the letter back neatly and set it on her desk, unsure what to do next. That night, after dinner, she took out her own stationery cream-colored, left over from years ago when she thought she might write more, and drafted a reply. Her handwriting was slower now, less sure than it once had been, but there was something soothing in the way the pen moved across the page. She thanked him for making her feel visible, for not treating her like an afterthought. She didn't say too much, just enough, and so it began. The letters came every few days, never rushed, never forced. Graham's words were measured, but never cold. He wrote about the books he'd been reading, about a hiking trail he liked not far from Brattleboro, about the sound of wind through pines in the early morning. In one letter, he included a pressed maple leaf deep red, perfectly intact, taped gently to the corner of the page. "Thought you might like a piece of that wedding day," he wrote. Natalie smiled when she read that one. She tucked the leaf between the pages of a novel she kept on her nightstand. Every now and then, she'd open it just to see if the color had changed. As the days shortened and the air took on its early November bite, Natalie found herself checking the mailbox with a kind of quiet anticipation. She never rushed, she didn't hover, but her steps down the gravel path were lighter when she spotted one of his envelopes. There was something about letters about words that took time to write, that couldn't be edited once the ink touched the paper. They were slower, more intentional, and in that slowness, something inside her softened. She told Graham about her work editing memoirs, mostly for people who had lived full lives but never told their stories. She described her small office at the publishing house downtown, and how the radiator knocked like an impatient ghost on cold mornings. She didn't say much about her past, not right away, but eventually she mentioned her ex-husband, how their 6 years of marriage had been full of long silences and polite nods, how she'd stopped recognizing herself by the end of it, how she'd left one morning and never went back, not because of one big moment, but because of 1,000 small ones that hollowed her out. And Graham, in return, told her about his wife, Elise. They had been married 12 years. She died in a car accident 5 years ago. He said her laughter had been the soundtrack of his life until it stopped. After that, the world became quiet in a way he never asked for. He hadn't dated since, hadn't written letters since either. But now, he wrote. In one letter, folded more carefully than the rest, he wrote, "I haven't written like this since she passed, but somehow, the words come easier. With you." Natalie read that line 3 times. The first, with surprise. The second, with disbelief. The third, with something warm blooming quietly in her chest. She didn't know what they were doing, not really. They hadn't made promises, hadn't asked for anything. But in these letters, there was a kind of rhythm she hadn't known she missed. A rhythm of being seen, of being heard, of being answered. One Saturday morning, after a night of wind and rain, she sat on her front porch wrapped in an old knit blanket, holding his latest letter. The sky was overcast but soft, and the trees around her yard dropped their leaves in slow, dancing spirals. She didn't open the letter right away. Instead, she held it against her chest, breathing in the moment, the smell of the envelope, the quiet of the morning, the steady hum of something new. When she did read it, it was short, just a few lines about a soup he'd made from scratch, and how he was terrible at chopping onions, but great at following instructions. There was nothing grand in the words, nothing profound, and yet, she smiled. As the wind stirred the pile of golden leaves on her porch, she whispered, almost to herself, "What are we starting here?" There was no answer, just the whisper of paper, the rustle of trees, and the first shy warmth she'd felt in a long, long time. The invitation came on a Thursday morning, tucked inside a cream envelope that smelled faintly of pine and old paper. Just a single line in Graham's familiar handwriting. "If you're free Saturday, there's a coffee shop inside a used bookstore in Brattleboro. Worth a visit, quiet, like you might like." He signed only his name. No time suggested, no pressure, just the quiet offering of space. Natalie stared at the note for a long while before responding. Her reply, penned slowly that evening, was equally brief. "Saturday sounds lovely. I'll be there." The coffee shop was tucked into the back of a century-old building on Main Street, the kind of place that carried the scent of musty pages and cinnamon in every corner. Shelves leaned slightly with age, books stacked like memories. No music played. Only the occasional soft thud of a book being reshelved, the hiss of steam from behind the espresso bar, and murmurs low enough not to disturb the dust. Natalie arrived early. She wore a wool coat in soft gray, her hair loosely gathered at the nape of her neck. Her fingers fiddled with the clasp of her purse as she browsed the spines of old novels. Not really reading, just waiting. When Graham entered, he didn't startle her. He moved as he always did, quietly, intentionally, with a presence that filled the space without claiming it. He wore a navy sweater over a collared shirt, no jacket, his hair still damp from a light snow that had begun to fall. They didn't hug, didn't shake hands, just a gentle nod and a half smile that said more than any greeting could. They ordered coffee hers, a simple black pour-over, his, a dark roast with a hint of cardamom. Then they found a table near a tall window, where the snow dusted the sidewalk like sifted sugar. It wasn't a date, but her heart fluttered like it was. They talked first about books' childhood favorites, authors they'd returned to over the years. Natalie admitted she had a habit of rereading the same 3 novels every winter. Graham confessed he couldn't finish anything lately, but kept buying them anyway, as if ownership was enough to feel literate. They laughed, softly, the kind of laugh that starts in the eyes. Then came music. She loved Chopin on rainy days. He leaned more toward cello suites, especially in the early morning when the world was still waking up. They talked about favorite cafes in cities they once visited, how each place carried its own kind of silence. When Natalie mentioned she liked to keep fresh flowers in the house, even if no one else saw them, Graham didn't say anything right away. He just nodded, slowly, and said, "That says something beautiful about you." She blushed without knowing why. The air between them stayed gentle, unrushed. Like a page turned carefully, line by line. It wasn't until her second cup, as the snow thickened outside and the light inside grew warmer, that something shifted. Natalie had been telling a story about her mother, about how she used to collect antique teacups and label each with a year and a memory. She smiled at the memory, her voice softening. She had a stroke 3 years ago, Natalie said, eyes focused on the rim of her cup. We think it was caused by a faulty monitoring device, one of those wearable heart trackers. The recall came too late. She didn't expect anything in return. She'd meant it as an offering, not a question. But when she looked up, Graham wasn't looking at her. He stared down at his coffee, fingers motionless around the cup. His posture had changed, shoulders tighter, chin slightly lowered. It was subtle, but unmistakable, like a door in him had closed, quietly but firmly. She waited, but he didn't respond, just took a small sip of coffee, then said, almost absently, "I'm sorry. That must have been hard." It was the kind of reply that offered sympathy without opening anything else, the kind of line people gave when they had something to hide. Natalie felt a slight chill, not from him, exactly, but from something missing, something unsaid. For a few moments, the only sound was the low hum of the heater behind them. She traced a circle in the condensation on her mug, watching him. He looked up again, met her eyes, and smiled. But the smile didn't quite reach the corners. It felt rehearsed. The conversation moved on gently, carefully. They talked about recipes, about how winter seemed to come earlier every year, but the ease had shifted, and Natalie noticed. She didn't press him, she didn't ask, but a seed had been planted. When they parted outside, the snow had settled into a soft white blanket over the town. Natalie zipped up her coat, pulled her scarf tighter, and turned to face him. Graham looked at her with those kind eyes again, the same ones that had calmed her at the wedding. But now, they held something else. Not distance exactly, but weight. As if he was carrying something heavy in silence. He reached for her hand, not to hold, just to squeeze lightly, once. "Take care getting home," he said, then added, "Thanks for the conversation." He walked toward his car without another word. Natalie stood by her own car door, keys in hand, but not unlocking it yet. She watched his figure grow smaller, then vanish behind the soft swirl of snow. She had expected warmth today, connection, and for a while, she'd felt it. But now, something lingered in the space between them, something left unsaid. She rested her hand on the cold metal door, exhaled slowly, and whispered to herself, "What's he holding back?" She didn't know yet, but part of her knew deep down that the quiet between them had just begun to shift. The envelope wasn't in her mailbox. It was leaning against her front door when she returned from work, a plain, manila folder held closed with a single metal clasp. No return address, no postage, just her name, written in all caps with a black marker across the front. Natalie stared at it for a long moment, keys still in hand. The November wind curled around her ankles, lifting the hem of her coat, but she didn't move. Something about the folder felt wrong. Or maybe too intentional. She picked it up carefully, holding it away from her body like it might reveal something she wasn't ready to see. Inside her house, she laid it flat on the kitchen table, untouched for nearly an hour while the kettle boiled, whistled, and cooled. Only when the tea had turned lukewarm did she finally sit down, slowly unclasp the folder, and open it. The first page was a printed article, one she recognized vaguely, though she'd never read it fully. It was dated from 2 years ago. A headline in block letters, Whitmore Medical faces internal review over device failures. Her fingers tightened. She flipped the page. Another article, this one more recent, a lawsuit filed by the family of a young woman who died due to complications involving a heart monitor device. Natalie skimmed the paragraphs, her eyes catching on phrases like failure to report malfunctions and systemic oversight. The third page was different. It wasn't from a newspaper. It was a printed memo, likely leaked, she thought, from an internal meeting. Several names were highlighted. One of them was Graham's, Chief Operations Liaison, 5 years ago. Her heart thudded hard in her chest. The next page was short, a single handwritten note. On-lined paper. You're close to him? Maybe you should know. No name, no signature, just that. Natalie sat back in her chair, the paper slipping slightly from her fingers. She reached for her tea. It had gone cold. That night, she didn't sleep. Instead, she sat on the floor of her study with her laptop, surrounded by articles she pulled from online archives. She searched phrases she never thought she'd need again. Whitmore medical lawsuit, device recalls, stroke lawsuits, Vermont medical technology failure. The deeper she searched, the colder she felt. She didn't find Graham's name on every document, but enough to see a pattern. He had been part of the company during the height of its device expansion, the same period when error rates began to rise. His name appeared in quarterly reports, occasionally in press releases, and once in a letter to investors praising the rollout of the biometric monitoring division, the same division whose product had failed her mother. She pulled out a file she kept in a small locked drawer, the one she rarely touched. Inside were her mother's medical records scanned, printed, and clipped in quiet grief. She ran her finger over the device model number listed in the notes from the neurologist. Then she turned back to the online report from Whitmore Medical. Same model, same malfunction history, same quiet silence from the company. She stared at the screen, unblinking. Her stomach turned slowly, not from anger, but from something far more hollow: betrayal. The memories came back in pieces. Her mother, cheerful but tired, wearing the device with mild curiosity. It's supposed to catch irregularities, she had said. Doctors say it's top of the line. Then the phone call, the panic, the hospital room with too much light and too little warmth. Her mother's voice, distant and slurred, then, eventually, gone. Natalie had spent months trying to find someone accountable, but the company had been protected by legal layers and public relations. Every door had been locked. Eventually, she had stopped knocking. Until now. Now. Someone had left a key. By the time the sun rose, Natalie was still awake. Her hands were cold, her eyes red-rimmed from staring too long at names and numbers that blurred together like ghosts. And one name had returned again and again: Graham Whitmore. He hadn't lied, not directly. But he hadn't told her either. He hadn't said he was part of the company, hadn't mentioned what he did before his wife died, hadn't flinched when she told him about her mother. Except he had. That moment at the coffee shop, his silence, the way he stared at his cup, the quick change of subject. She had felt it. She just hadn't known what it meant. Now she did. Or she thought she did. And that was somehow worse. That evening, as dusk folded itself across the lake behind her house, Natalie sat on the porch wrapped in a heavy blanket. The wind had turned sharper. Leaves rattled across the deck like brittle thoughts. Beside her, a fresh envelope lay unopened, another letter from Graham. She recognized his handwriting instantly, the way the N in her name always dipped slightly lower than the rest of the letters. She hadn't opened it. She couldn't. Not yet. Because if it said the wrong thing, if it was just another gentle note about soup recipes or books or cello music, she might never forgive him. And if it said the right thing, she wasn't sure what she'd do with that either. The teacup beside her had gone untouched, a small curl of steam long since faded. She listened to the water lapping against the dock, the distant rustle of deer moving in the woods, and the louder rustle of questions she couldn't quiet. What had he known? When had he known it? And why? Of all people, had he chosen to sit beside her at that wedding? She pulled the blanket tighter, her breath visible now in the evening chill. The envelope remained unopened on her lap. She didn't cry. She didn't move. But inside, something steady had cracked, and the silence so comforting days ago now pressed heavy against her chest. The lake had changed with the season. Just weeks ago, it had glistened like a painting under autumn light, crimson leaves mirrored on still water, the kind of beauty that made silence feel holy. But now, in the gray slant of a November afternoon, it looked colder, not cruel, just honest. Natalie stood at the edge of the small dock behind her house, arms folded tightly across her chest, the folder resting on the wooden bench behind her. Graham was late, but she hadn't expected him to be early, or even punctual. She wasn't sure what she expected anymore. When he finally appeared, his footsteps were quiet. He wore a dark coat, collar turned up, hands in his pockets. His gaze found hers immediately, but he didn't smile, neither did she. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved between them like it had something to say first. Then Natalie gestured softly, almost involuntarily toward the bench. He sat. She remained standing. From the folder, she pulled out the first page, the article with the headline she could now recite by heart. She handed it to him. Then the next, then the memo. She didn't explain. She didn't accuse. She simply said, "I found these." Graham took the papers slowly, methodically. He looked at them one by one, then placed them gently on the bench beside him. His hands were steady, his face unreadable. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost hoarse. "I know what they are." Natalie waited, but nothing more came. She felt something tighten in her chest. Not anger, not yet. Just a rising pressure behind the ribs, like breath that couldn't find its way out. So, she asked, her voice more brittle than she intended. Graham looked down at the papers again, then out over the lake. "I can't say anything," he said quietly. "Not yet." His words were soft, but to her, they landed like frost on glass. For a long time, there was only the sound of wind on water and the faint rustle of dry reeds near the shore. Natalie stepped closer, just enough for him to see the change in her eyes. "My mother," she said, barely above a whisper. Her stroke, the device, the company, it's all connected. Isn't it? Graham didn't look away, but he didn't answer. She took that silence and folded it into something sharper. "I thought we were done pretending." There it was, the first real fracture in the space between them. Graham's expression shifted not into guilt, not even regret, but something heavier, like someone who knew this moment was inevitable and still hoped it wouldn't come. "I'm under legal hold," he said at last, voice barely audible. "There's an internal investigation. I can't speak to anyone about what happened. Not yet. I shouldn't have even—" He stopped himself. Natalie took a breath, cold and shallow. "You shouldn't have sat beside me at that wedding." He closed his eyes, just for a second. But it said everything. She turned her back to the lake, to him, to the silence. "I don't need a full confession," she said, more to the wind than to him. "I just needed you to say something real, anything. Because I opened something I didn't think I could open again." Her voice trembled, not from volume, but from all the weight she was trying to keep inside. And now, I don't know if any of it was true. Graham stood slowly, as if each movement cost him something. It was, he said, but it was too late. Truth, when delayed, becomes a different shape, one harder to trust. Natalie took a step back, not dramatically, just enough to say, "This is where I draw the line." "You had 100 chances to tell me," she said. "You heard me talk about my mother. You looked me in the eye and let me believe you were someone else." "I'm still me," he replied, but the words didn't land. Not with weight, not with warmth. She shook her head. "No, you're not." The clouds had thickened now. The sky above the lake had turned a flat, unforgiving gray. A few birds wheeled high in the distance, their calls sharp against the stillness. Graham moved toward her. Just a step. "Natalie." "I didn't plan this," he said, voice rough. "I didn't sit beside you at that wedding because I knew who you were. I didn't start writing letters to deceive you. I just forgot how it felt to be seen." She held his gaze this time. "And now I can't unsee what I've found." There it was, the quiet verdict. Not shouted, not dramatized, just placed gently between them, like a stone too heavy to carry further. Graham didn't speak again, and Natalie, finally, turned to leave. She walked back up the path to her house without looking back. The cold nipped at her cheeks, but she didn't notice. Her thoughts were louder than the wind. When she stepped inside, the warmth of the house felt false, like something she didn't quite belong to anymore. She locked the door behind her, not out of fear, out of finality. She turned off her phone, pulled down the blinds, let the dim gray of the evening settle over the room like dust. Then, without meaning to, she brushed against the edge of her desk, and the unopened letter, Graham's last one, slipped off and landed softly on the floor. She stared at it for a long moment, but she didn't pick it up. She just stood there, hands at her sides, breathing slowly, like someone relearning how to be alone again. Natalie thought the quiet would help, that by shutting off her phone, ignoring the letter, and retreating into the small, well-ordered corners of her life, she could close the door on all of it. The doubts, the grief, the sense of having fallen for something built on silence. But days passed, and the quiet didn't soothe her. It itched under her skin, a hum she couldn't tune out. Her world had once been built on quiet things books, afternoon tea, handwritten edits and pencil margins. But now, even the stillness of her home felt too loud, too brittle. Every creak of the floorboards made her pause. Every flicker of shadow in the hallway pulled her eyes. She tried to work. She sat at her desk in the publishing office, red pen in hand, manuscript open. But she kept glancing at the window behind her, and she wasn't sure what she was expecting to see. The message arrived a week later, not in the mail, not in another letter, just a simple text from an unknown number, typed in all lowercase, "Stop digging, or you'll regret it." That was all. No name, no punctuation, just that small, dark sentence blinking back at her from the phone screen. Natalie stared at it until the screen went black. Her hands trembled, not from fear, not exactly, more from a realization that reached cold into her spine. This wasn't about Graham anymore. She changed her locks that day. The hardware store clerk didn't ask questions when she bought the new deadbolt, just rang it up, handed her the small box, and said, "Take care now." She nodded, forcing a smile, and walked out with her hand clutching her bag tighter than necessary. That night, she didn't sleep. She kept the porch light on. Every 20 minutes, she checked that the doors were locked, windows closed. Her tea went cold on the counter. She tried reading but couldn't get past the same paragraph. Around 1:20 m, she finally allowed herself to lie down. By 2:10, she was still staring at the ceiling, and that's when she heard it. It was subtle, a floorboard outside, just a creak. Could have been the wind, could have been nothing. She sat up, slowly, no lights outside the window, just darkness, pressed flat against the glass. She slipped out of bed, pulled on a sweater, moved softly across the room. Her bare feet made no sound on the floor. She reached the front door and paused, listening. There it was again, a creak, not loud, not rushed, just deliberate. Natalie's breath hitched. She stepped back, gently pulled the curtain beside the window, and froze. A man stood on her porch, not moving, not knocking, just standing there, arms at his sides, face turned slightly toward the door, but not enough for her to see clearly. The porch light should have helped, but it cast his face in shadows. The way the old bulb flickered made him look less like a man, more like an outline. She stood there, unmoving. He didn't shift, didn't speak. Seconds passed, then a minute, then two, then, without warning, he turned and walked away down the steps, into the darkness, gone before she could react. By the time she grabbed her phone and called the police, he had vanished. The officer who arrived 20 minutes later was polite, but tired. He took her statement, glanced around, shined a flashlight into the woods. No footprints, no camera, nothing. Probably just a trespasser, he said. We've had a few lately, teenagers, maybe, but she saw it in his eyes. He didn't believe that. He just didn't want to worry her. The next morning, Natalie sat on her porch in daylight, coffee clutched tight between both hands, scanning the yard like she might still find him standing there. But there was nothing, just fallen leaves, scattered pine needles, and the memory of fear still clinging to the steps. It wasn't just about the letter anymore. It wasn't even about Graham. This, whatever this was bigger, dirtier, and someone clearly didn't want her asking questions. That night, she pulled out the folder again, laid every document flat across her dining table, took notes, drew connections, highlighted phrases, Googled executives, board members, addresses, and she saw it. There were layers, not just one failure, not just one recall, but a web of omissions patterned, precise, deliberate. She read whistleblower reports, saw how smaller complaints had been buried under legal jargon and quietly settled, how families had received just enough compensation to stay silent, but never enough to be heard. Her mother hadn't been the only one, not by a long shot. Natalie stared at the names listed on a redacted internal memo. There it was, again Graham's title, his department. She didn't know how deep he was in, but he was there, and so was she now. That Sunday, she packed everything into a large yellow envelope. She printed a cover letter, unsigned, no return address. She had chosen a newspaper in Boston, one with a reputation for digging deep, one that didn't scare easily. She planned to mail it in the morning, but she never made it to the post office. As she backed her car down the driveway the next day, Natalie caught a flash in her rearview mirror. A dark sedan pulled in fast from the side road and parked just behind her, blocking her exit. She braked, heart pounding. The driver didn't step out, just sat there, windows tinted too dark to see through. She waited. Nothing. Then, slowly, the car reversed, backed out, drove off. No words, no confrontation, just a warning. She sat in her driveway for a long time after that. And for the first time, she wondered if she was in over her head. It happened so fast. One moment. Natalie was gripping the steering wheel, her eyes locked on the two men who had stepped out from the dark sedan, one in a black coat, the other in a windbreaker too thin for the cold. Their faces were calm, but their approach was anything but casual. She felt her throat tighten. The documents were in her bag, her phone on silent, her heart somewhere in her stomach. Then, suddenly headlights. A second car veered into the narrow drive, engine roaring louder than necessary. Tires scraped gravel. Before she could fully register what was happening, the two men looked up, startled, and then they ran. The second car stopped just feet from her bumper. The door swung open, and there he was. Graham. She hadn't seen him in nearly 2 weeks. Not since the day at the lake. Not since the moment she had told him he wasn't the man she thought he was. Now. Here he was again, jacket half-zipped, breath visible in the cold, eyes scanning the woods like he expected someone else to follow. "Get in," he said, not loudly, but with a tone that left no room for questions. Natalie hesitated only a moment. Then she grabbed her bag, opened her door, and slipped into the passenger seat of his truck. They drove without speaking. The roads narrowed as they climbed through a wooded area outside Brattleboro. Pines pressed close on either side, dark and watchful. The sky was cloud-heavy, threatening snow, and Natalie counted the turns to ground herself. 1, 2, 3. Left onto an unpaved road, branches scraping the windows like whispered warnings. Finally, the truck pulled up to a small, weather-worn cabin nestled between the trees. Smoke curled faintly from a metal chimney. A single porch light glowed warm against the gloom. Inside, it smelled like cedar and old books. A fireplace crackled. The furniture was minimal, but soft wool blankets, faded rugs, shelves lined with journals. It didn't feel abandoned. Graham hung his coat and turned to her. "This place was hers," he said. "My wife's. She used to come here to write. I haven't been back since she passed. Until now." Natalie didn't speak. She stood by the small table, her bag still clutched to her chest like armor. He gestured to a chair near the fire. She didn't move, so he sat instead, leaned forward, elbows on knees, hands clasped. "I'm going to tell you everything," he said, finally, and this time she didn't stop him. He began slowly. After his wife's death, Graham had stepped away from his role at Whitmore Medical, but not completely. He stayed on as a consultant, occasionally pulled into board meetings, strategy calls just enough to feel like he hadn't fully abandoned the world they had built together. "She was the reason I joined the company," he said, voice distant now. "She believed in accessible tech, devices that could warn patients early, save lives. It wasn't about profit, not for her." Natalie watched him closely. He looked tired, older than before, but after she died, things shifted. He continued. There were changes in leadership, new partnerships. Suddenly, devices were being rushed to market, corners cut. I started seeing reports that didn't make sense, test data that looked doctored. He ran a hand over his face. "And then I found out someone had used my clearance, my name, to greenlight one of the earliest releases of the device that would later be recalled." Natalie's breath caught. "My mother's device?" she asked, voice barely audible. He nodded. "I didn't authorize it," he said, meeting her eyes. "But on paper, it looks like I did." There was a long silence between them. The only sound was the pop of wood in the fireplace. "I've been trying to prove it," Graham said, quietly. "I have no authority anymore, but I've been working with an internal ethics officer off the books. We're gathering documentation, timelines, sign-offs, trying to trace who signed what, when, and under whose credentials." He looked down. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want you in it." Natalie's arms tightened around her bag. "You didn't tell me," she echoed, "because you didn't trust me." "No," he said, quickly, "because I did." She turned away, faced the window. The forest was a blur of black and gray outside. "And I knew what it would cost you if you saw my name on those papers before I could explain," he added. "I didn't want you to carry the confusion I've been carrying." She stayed silent. Then, after a long moment, he said the one thing that pulled her back into the room. "I didn't lie to you," he said. "I was trying to protect you, but I understand if you don't believe that anymore. It wasn't a plea, just a statement. Tired, honest." Natalie finally let her bag fall to the floor. She sat down across from him, stared into the fire. Her chest felt tight, but not just with anger. There was something else. Grief, maybe for what had almost been, or the weight of something real she wasn't sure how to carry. On the small wooden table beside the fireplace sat a worn ceramic mug. It had a faded floral pattern and a tiny chip on the handle. Across its front, in blue cursive, were two simple words: "Begin again." She reached out and turned the mug slightly toward herself. Didn't say anything. Didn't need to. It started with a misplaced folder. Natalie was cleaning out a dusty filing cabinet in the back room of the publishing house, one she hadn't opened in over a year. The cabinet belonged to Lillian, a former editor who retired before Natalie came on board. It was filled with half-edited manuscripts, invoices, coffee-stained memos, nothing of importance, until she opened a plain brown file labeled Client Dispute, 2017. Inside, buried between printouts of correspondence, was a CD. Handwritten on the front in faded Sharpie were the words Review Meeting, Sept 12. She almost tossed it aside. Almost, but something about the date nagged her. September 12th, 2017. That was around the time Graham's name first appeared on the internal documents she'd found, the ones tied to the flawed device approvals. Heart pounding. She slipped the disk into her old laptop and turned up the volume. It was a recorded conference call, muffled at first, but then clear. A voice she didn't recognize, authoritative, clipped, the vice president of compliance. "We'll just run the signature through the old channel," he said. "Whitmore doesn't need to be looped in. His name still carries weight better on paper." Another voice, female, hesitant. "But he hasn't signed anything since the review board. If this leaks, it won't. You think he checks approval trails? He's out. And if it ever comes back, it'll look like an admin error." The silence that followed felt heavier than words. Natalie sat frozen, staring at the screen. It was the proof, the one thing Graham never had. And now, somehow, it had landed in her hands. She called him immediately. He didn't answer at first, but 5 minutes later, her phone lit up. His voice was quiet. "Natalie." She didn't wait. "I found it." She played him the recording. On the other end, there was nothing but the sound of him breathing. Then, finally, "Where did you get that?" Her voice broke slightly. "A filing cabinet, at work. I don't know why it was there, but it's real." Another long pause. Then Graham exhaled like a man who'd been underwater for years. That night, in the quiet of her living room, the two of them sat side by side, laptop open, documents spread across the coffee table. They cross-referenced names, dates, timestamps, built a chain of evidence neither of them thought they'd ever hold. They didn't rush it. Natalie knew how fragile truth could be if handled too fast. Once everything was organized, she reached out to a reporter she trusted, Amira Shaw, a senior investigative journalist with the Boston Standard, known for her fearless work on corporate fraud. Amira responded within an hour. The next morning, she drove out to meet them in a diner just off Route 5. Graham handed over the evidence. No lawyers, no press, just trust. "I'm not asking you to protect me," he told Amira. "I'm asking you to expose them." 3 weeks later, the headline ran front page, "Exclusive Whitmore medical executives fake signatures. Rush devices to market internal whistleblower, vindicated." It was surreal. The fallout was swift. The CEO was suspended. Several board members were subpoenaed. An FBI inquiry was launched. And Graham's name was cleared publicly. Officially. Natalie sat on her porch that morning, reading the article with shaking hands. She couldn't stop staring at one sentence. Mr. Whitmore's signature was misused without consent, as confirmed by internal recordings and third-party testimonies. Her eyes blurred. She closed the paper, set it gently beside her cup of tea, and looked out over the yard. It was snowing lightly, first snow of the season, quiet, steady, clean. She hadn't cried since her mother passed, but now the tears came easy, not from grief, from relief. That evening, while organizing the last of the documents to return to Graham, she found something she hadn't seen before. A thin envelope tucked into the folder. No stamp, no address, just her name, written in familiar handwriting. Inside was a letter, folded carefully. Her hands shook as she unfolded the page. The first line made her breath catch. "You once told me pretending made things easier, but I don't want to pretend anymore." She read slowly, carefully, like the words might dissolve if she moved too fast. "I've made more mistakes than I can name, but the one I regret most was staying silent when I should have spoken up for my wife, for your mother, and for you. I know I can't undo what's been done, But I also know that truth without love is just another kind of armor, and I don't want to live armored anymore. If you're still pretending we came together, I'd like to make it real now." Natalie sat down on the porch step, the letter clutched in her hands. The wind had picked up, scattering dry leaves along the walkway. In the distance, she could hear the sound of someone's car door closing. A neighbor's dog barked once, then went quiet. She looked toward the mailbox. It was still open. She hadn't even realized she'd left it that way. Inside was nothing but a dusting of snow, but her heart felt full. She folded the letter carefully, pressed it to her chest, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she whispered out loud, "Maybe it's time to stop pretending too." The house was quiet again, not the tense, uncertain kind of quiet she had lived with for weeks, but something gentler, like the air after a long storm, where nothing moved too quickly, and every creak of the floor felt more like a sigh than a warning. Natalie sat at the old writing desk near her bedroom window. The wood was scratched, the drawer stuck a little on the left side, and the chair groaned every time she shifted her weight. She liked it that way. A small ceramic lamp cast a warm pool of light across the blank pages in front of her. Next to it, a steaming mug of chamomile tea sent slow spirals into the air. Outside, the wind tapped gently against the glass, carrying the last leaves of autumn down the empty street. And in front of her lay a stack of letters written but never sent. The first one was dated only days after the wedding. She had written it in a hurry. Still flushed from the surrealness of the moment, Graham had pulled out a chair beside her and whispered, "Pretend you came with me." Her handwriting was uneven, like her thoughts hadn't caught up with her emotions. "I don't even know your last name yet, but something about you made the room quieter, like I could breathe again. I wanted to ask you to stay. I didn't." The next was written the day she received his first letter. The paper had tiny wrinkles where her hands had trembled. Unsure if she should open the envelope, I told myself not to respond. That writing to a stranger is foolish. But your words, they felt like walking into a warm room after a cold day. You wrote like someone who doesn't speak often, and somehow, I understood everything you didn't say. She had never mailed that one either. Another letter, this one darker, was from the week she found the file. The anger showed in the pressure of the pen, the way the ink bled heavier in some corners. "I trusted you. I wanted to believe that someone could be good, could see me without needing to hide. But now, I wonder if I was just another woman mistaking kindness for truth." She remembered crying after writing that one, and still keeping it. Then came the one she wrote the night he reappeared, the night he pulled her into his truck without asking for forgiveness, just giving protection. "You saved me, and I hated that I still wanted you to. There's a difference between safety and trust. I'm still learning which one I need more." Now, tonight, she wrote one more, but this one was different. Her handwriting was steady. The words came slower, not rushed, not tangled with fear or doubt, just honest. She didn't try to explain everything, didn't try to recount the ache or the relief, just one line, centered on the page, like it had been waiting its turn all along. "Let's not pretend anymore." She folded it carefully, slipped it into a pale cream envelope. No embellishment, no return address. Just his name and cabin mailbox, Graham Whitmore. She pressed the flap shut, smoothed the edges with her fingers, then stood up. Outside, the air was colder than it had been all week. Winter was near, not yet here, but close enough that the wind carried its scent clean, dry, edged with pine. Natalie pulled on her coat and stepped onto the porch. The mailbox at the end of the walkway creaked faintly as she opened it. Inside were no bills, no advertisements, no forgotten flyers, just a quiet space, waiting. She placed the envelope inside, closed the lid, and stood still for a long moment, not expecting anything, not fearing anything, just breathing. She looked up at the sky. The stars had come out faint and shy, scattered behind thin clouds. And in that quiet space between inhale and exhale, she realized these letters had never really been about Graham. They had been about her, about all the voices she'd buried, all the questions she'd silenced, all the fears she'd carried like glass in her chest shattering every time someone got too close. Writing had helped, not because it fixed everything, but because it let her be real again. She turned to go back inside. There was no music playing, no phone ringing, no one waiting with open arms, but the warmth inside her chest no longer depended on any of that. It had come from choosing to speak, even if the world never answered. The invitation had come in the mail, a thick ivory envelope with her name, handwritten in precise blue ink. No return address, no explanation. Just a simple card tucked inside annual medical innovation and humanitarian recognition. Gala, December 2nd, 7:00 p.m., Greenleaf Hall, Brattleboro, Vermont. And below, in smaller script, I hope you'll come. No pretending this time. Natalie had stared at it for a long while. It wasn't fear that made her hesitate, or doubt. Just the quiet weight of knowing that showing up would mean stepping fully out of the shadows. On the evening of the event, Natalie dressed slowly. She chose a deep navy dress, simple, long-sleeved, and warm enough for the Vermont air. Around her neck, she wore a silver pendant that had belonged to her mother. On her feet, her most comfortable black heels scuffed at the toe, but dependable. Outside, snow had begun to fall, not the heavy kind, just soft flakes floating like feathers through the streetlights. The town felt hushed, reverent, as if something sacred was about to begin. Greenleaf Hall was bright that night. Strings of warm white lights were wrapped around every railing and column. Inside, chandeliers sparkled gently above round tables dressed in ivory cloths. People in evening wear moved through the space with soft conversation and laughter. The scent of winter florals and pine lingered in the air. Natalie stepped inside and paused, letting her eyes adjust. She hadn't seen Graham yet. Part of her wondered if he'd changed his mind. But when the usher led her down the aisle toward the stage area, she spotted him, front row, far left, waiting. Graham stood when he saw her. He wasn't in a tuxedo, just a dark suit, crisp white shirt, and a slate blue tie that matched the flecks in his eyes. His hair was a little longer than before, his posture relaxed, but alert. He offered no grand gesture, no dramatic smile. Just a quiet nod and a look that said, "I'm glad you're here." She sat beside him, heart steady, and for the first time in a long while, there was no weight behind her smile. The ceremony began. A few brief speeches, recognition of advancements in rural health care, mental health outreach, and post-operative recovery programs. Names were called, applause offered, lives acknowledged. Natalie listened, hands folded neatly in her lap. But her thoughts drifted not away, but deeper, into the space between this moment and all the ones that had come before. The weddings, the letters, the porch shadows, the unanswered questions, and now, this, a room full of light. At the end of the program, before the guests were dismissed, one final presenter stepped forward. He was a physician, aging but sharp-eyed, and he spoke briefly about unsung contributions, those who worked quietly behind the scenes to bring about change. He mentioned an anonymous donor who had helped fund a rural therapy program after a major recall nearly shut it down. And though he never said Graham's name, Natalie knew some stories don't need to be told aloud to be heard. After the applause faded, as people began to gather coats and exchange farewells, Graham turned slightly toward her. From the inside pocket of his coat, he pulled out a small box, black velvet, no ribbon. He placed it gently in her hands. "Open it when you're ready," he said. Natalie looked at him. His eyes were calm, no urgency, no pleading, just quiet presence. She opened the box. Inside was a fountain pen, not flashy, not expensive, just elegant sleek silver with a navy blue lacquer body, and a soft gold clip. On the side, engraved in delicate script, was her name, Natalie Bennett, and tucked beneath the pen, a small cream-colored card, a gift for a woman who rewrote my story. Her throat tightened. Of all the things she'd imagined, flowers, an apology, even silence, this gesture moved her the most, because it wasn't about grand romance. It was about recognition of who she was, what she had done, how she had helped him rewrite more than just a reputation, but the narrative of his life. She looked up. Graham said nothing. He didn't need to, and this time, neither did she. She closed the box carefully and held it in both hands. Then, without thinking, she reached for his hand, not out of impulse, not out of doubt, but because it felt natural. He took it without hesitation. His fingers were warm, steady, familiar, no pretending, just presence. They walked out of Greenleaf Hall together, still holding hands. The cold met them gently like an old friend, not a warning. Snow was falling thicker now, soft flakes clinging to the shoulders of Graham's coat and catching in Natalie's hair. The street lamps glowed golden against the white. Behind them, the soft hum of laughter and closing doors faded into the hush of night. Ahead of them, the sidewalk stretched on, quiet, clean, waiting. Natalie tightened her grip on his hand and smiled. Not because the past was fixed, but because the future didn't have to be feared. The lake was still. Early spring had arrived in Vermont with its soft, tentative light and quiet promises. The trees had begun to bud, small green whispers against the last gray remnants of winter. The air carried the scent of damp earth and something faintly floral, like memories blooming just beneath the surface. Natalie stood barefoot on the wooden dock, her dress brushing against her calves. It wasn't white. It wasn't even new. Just a soft linen the color of pearl, simple and light, like the way she wanted to feel today. Behind her, only a handful of chairs had been arranged. No rows, no aisles, just a small semicircle of people who mattered: her aunt, Graham's sister, two longtime friends from the publishing house, and an elderly couple from the local cafe who had insisted on bringing lemon shortbread cookies. There were no chandeliers, no floral arches, no music, but the quiet lap of water against wood, and the breeze moving gently through the pine trees. Anne waiting at the edge of the dock, wearing a navy suit and the calmest smile she had ever seen, was Graham. She walked to him slowly, not because she was uncertain, but because she wanted to remember this. Every step, every detail, the sun on her shoulders, the slight creak of the dock beneath her feet, the way his hands were folded in front of him, as if holding something invisible and sacred. When she reached him, he didn't speak right away. He just looked at her, as if he too was memorizing. Then, slowly, he took her hands in his. "I don't have perfect words," he said softly, "but I know how to mean them." A pause. "I can't promise I'll always know the right thing to say, or do. I can't promise you that life won't come for us again in ways we can't predict." His thumbs traced slow circles over the backs of her hands. "But I do promise this: I will stay when it's hard. I will listen when it's quiet. I will hold space for your fear and your joy. And I will never ask you to pretend not ever again." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside, a ring, not flashy, no diamonds, just a smooth gold band with a tiny engraving on the inside. "Begin again." He slipped it onto her finger. She hadn't realized she was crying until the ring caught a drop of it, glinting just slightly in the sunlight. She squeezed his hands, then let out a soft breath. Her voice was steady, but warm. "You once asked me to pretend," she said. He blinked gently, startled by the memory. She smiled. "And I'm glad you did, because that day I started to believe again, in connection, in kindness, in something bigger than the ache I carried." She paused, leaning her forehead lightly against his. "I don't need you to be perfect. I just need you to be here. And I need to keep choosing each other, every day. Not because it's easy, but because it's real." They stood like that for a moment, no need for a minister or an audience, just their breaths mingling in the cool spring air. Then Natalie reached up and placed her hand gently over his chest. His heart was beating steady beneath her palm, a quiet, unwavering rhythm. She closed her eyes, and in that moment, nothing was performative. Nothing was imagined, nothing borrowed or blue or borrowed from a book. Just two people, and the truth between them. Later, they would eat cake with their fingers, sitting on a wool blanket beside the lake. They'd drink coffee from mismatched mugs and laugh when Graham accidentally stepped into the water, trying to retrieve a floating napkin. The wind would pick up and scatter flower petals across the dock, and Natalie would tuck one behind her ear. But none of that would matter quite as much as this one moment here, now. With the sun setting behind them and the sky shifting into soft lavender, Graham kissed the back of her hand where the ring now lived. Natalie looked at him, her eyes clear. "You're home," she said, not as a metaphor, but as a promise. The guests clapped gently, some brushing away tears, others simply smiling like they'd seen something rare and good. And then, hand in hand, Natalie and Graham stepped off the dock and walked slowly back toward the cabin. The path was still soft from melted snow, and wildflowers peeked up along the edges. The past had been heavy, but the future was light. As they reached the porch, Natalie turned for one last look at the lake. The surface reflected the last of the sunlight. A golden path stretched across the water, flickering slightly in the breeze like an invitation. She smiled, because she knew now stories didn't just live in books. They lived in quiet mornings, in hands held through hard seasons, in letters written and finally sent, in rings that didn't promise perfection but presence. And most of all, they lived in the spaces between pretending and truth, where love, real and flawed and whole, finally took root. Sometimes, life doesn't fall apart in loud, dramatic ways. Sometimes, it unravels quietly through missed conversations, unspoken fears, and the simple ache of feeling unseen. This story reminds us that healing doesn't always come through grand gestures or perfect endings. It comes in small, courageous choices, answering a letter, showing up when it's easier to disappear, telling the truth even when it trembles in your voice. We all carry stories some we're proud of, others we keep tucked away. But when we choose to share them, even imperfectly, we open the door for connection, forgiveness, and perhaps a new beginning. Love in later years may look different. It's not always fireworks, it's presence. It's being seen. It's choosing each other, not just once, but every ordinary day. And maybe, just maybe, it's in the pretending that we sometimes remember what it feels like to believe again. So, if you've ever felt too late, too broken, or too alone, this story is a gentle reminder. It's never too late to begin again. Thank you for spending your time with us and walking through this heartfelt journey. If this story touched you, reminded you of something you once believed in, or gave you hope to believe again, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us bring more meaningful stories to life. Until next time, take care and never stop believing in second chances.